Genesis chapter 32. Sometimes the hardest lessons are simple. This is a simple lesson. God can't do his work through a proud vessel. It's pretty simple. God can't do, or let me say it this way, it's probably more appropriate. God won't do his work through a proud vessel. I want you to picture this. Just try and picture this in your mind. Paul the Apostle's been shipwrecked multiple times. He's been beaten, left dead, stoned to death. He's been abandoned by his friends. He's been abandoned by his own nation. He's been persecuted continually. And suddenly a demonic attack falls on him. Attacks his flesh in 2 Corinthians. And he calls it a thorn. And it was so bad, so much agony, that here's the Apostle Paul, who has raised the dead, who has been bitten by snakes, who has done the miracles of God, has had revelations and visions of Jesus Christ. Here's Paul crying out to God 3 times, God, please take away the suffering in me. Please take away the suffering. And he is given the hardest single lesson in discipleship that any of us will ever experience. My grace is sufficient for you. My strength is made perfect in weakness. That's the answer that the Lord God verbally responds to the Apostle Paul in his terrible suffering. My grace, Paul, is sufficient for you. I am not removing the suffering. Now, that's 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9. You could probably just flip open your Bibles and write right next to that verse, Genesis chapter 32. God gives us an entire chapter to validate and confirm that message he gave to Paul, that his grace is what we need. Jesus never once said it would be painless to be a Christian. Jesus never once said you were guaranteed to live if you became a Christian. Jesus never once said there would be a lack of difficulty, enemies, turmoil, suffering, both demonic and human, if you followed him. And he gave us an example by walking through the greatest suffering a human could walk through at that time. If you have never studied the crucifixion and do not understand the suffering that occurs on the cross, in fact, we have come up with a word to describe the worst suffering you could go through, and it's called excruciating pain. And it's Latin, excruciating, from the cross. That's the word. So the cross was the worst. And he went through it, and he did not fight against it. And he himself pleaded with the Father. How many times? 3 times. How many times did Paul plead with the Father? 3 times. Take this cup away from me, Father, please, if it is possible. But he, like Paul, came to the conclusion, but whatever is best, do that, Father. Whatever is best. And what was best happened to be the cross. Now, as we become Christians, we all are aware that there's some difficulty associated with that. In this world, you'll have tribulation, but be of good cheer, I've overcome the world, Jesus has told us. So we know there's some trouble coming. But are you really ready for excruciating? I am not. Anybody who says they are does not know what excruciating is. But there are some in our midst, even some who were associated with the UCC shootings, who are in excruciating suffering. And I have been asked by some of them, why? Why would God allow such a thing to happen? The answer is Genesis 32. And so it's a simple message, but as we look at it, I want you to ask the question, are you really fully God's? Really? When he said, unless you take up your cross in Luke chapter 9, daily, and deny yourself and follow me, you cannot be mine. This is a hard message. It is the hardest message. In discipleship, you can teach on prayer and people pray. In discipleship, you can teach on evangelism and they share the gospel. In discipleship, you can teach on Bible study and they'll take open the Bible and they'll learn to study. In discipleship, you try and teach on sacrificial suffering and taking up the cross, and you find that you must return to that topic every single day because nobody chooses suffering. But what if God does? Paul says, death is working in me. What's the rest of that? But life in you. I shall fill up the sufferings that were lacking, that Jesus suffered for the church, Paul says. I'll fill them up in my own body. I'll suffer. So here we have Jacob running, well, at this point, home. He's escaped Laban, who wanted to kill him. He now has a barrier behind him called Mitzpah, right? Literally, you cross over that rock, I kill you, Laban said. So he can't go home. He's got a brother whose the last words he heard were, as soon as I see you, I'm going to kill you. In front of him, he's in a wilderness between Syria and the Promised Land. He's heading step by step into the greatest conflict he could ever experience in life with all of his little kids. He's already struggling. And we find him in Genesis chapter 32. So Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. That is an unbelievable statement. I start thinking about that. It's hard for me to swallow that, but I believe it. You know that angels have been mentioned in the Bible more than 275 times. Angels. And we know that in Hebrews chapter 1, it tells us what an angel's main duty is. An angel's main duty, Hebrews 1, verse 14. Are they not all ministering spirits? So an angel is a ministering spirit sent forth to minister for those who will inherit salvation. The number one job of angels is to help you. Think about that. Their job description is to help you. So he's headed towards this terrible conflict. He looks up and he sees angels. I began thinking about the angels that I know that are in the New Testament. Think about the terrible moment when there was no body, when Jesus had been crucified. They've been for 3 days in great sorrow, and they appear, and an angel appears and says, don't be afraid. He's not here. Met Mary Magdalene, met the women, appeared multiple times to the soldiers who ran away in fear. Angels could meet you. In fact, we're told to just be careful because sometimes we run into them, we don't know we've met an angel. Now, but I don't know about you, but that doesn't process with me. I don't walk down the road and see an angel. I don't think. Jacob is given a great opportunity here. The last time he saw an angel was when? When he was running away from Esau in Genesis 28. He lays down in the middle of the night, puts a rock out for a pillow. He's got nothing but a stick. God opens up the heavens, stands at the top of it. We found out that was Jesus Christ standing at the top of this ladder, and the ladder is full of angels. And they're going and coming and coming and going and going and coming. So Jacob has known that there are angels helping him. And so at this time of great fear, he sees these angels. And it doesn't seem like he sees one angel. Look what he says. When Jacob saw them, and it doesn't say anybody else saw them, he said, this is God's camp. Last time he saw all the angels, he said, this is God's house. Bethel. This is God's camp. And he called the name of that place Mahanaim, which literally means double camp. Double camp. The next time you're afraid, I want you to remember Jesus said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. The next time you're afraid for your children, remember that Jesus said that their angels always see the face of my Father, the angels of the little ones. I'm talking about children. Always see the face of my Father in heaven. Next time you're worried about your child. Next time your kid flips out of a tree from 20, 25 feet and pile drives his face into the concrete down below and looks like he breaks his neck and fractures his entire face, and he's life flighted to OHSU and he's flying up there and you're sitting next to him in the airplane, sure he's going to die. Remember, it's a double camp. That's my story. You ever see Theron's scar? That's the mark of God. That's the limp that Jacob was given. We're going to talk about that. No greater joy can there be than for God to give you a limp, to remind you that always it is his strength. My grace is sufficient for you, Travis. My grace is sufficient for your children, Travis. My grace is sufficient for your wife, Travis. God is greater. God is greater. He names it double camp. Just a couple stories that I ran across. You know, the Lord has promised in Psalm 34:7, if you fear the Lord, the angel of the Lord encamps around you. Psalm 34:7, you are not alone. Not only does Jesus Christ dwell in you, but his ministering spirits minister to you in Psalm 34:7. Don't be afraid. There was a Scottish missionary, his name was John Paton. He was sent out to a place called the New Hebrides Islands, which is now Vanuatu, if you know that. And they were surrounded, they were continually sharing with cannibals and violent tribalists. And there was a story, a true story, about one night when they came to kill him and his family at the camp, at the headquarters. And you probably know where this is going because I've heard this story from multiple missionaries where it has happened. And they came to attack him at night, and John and his wife got on their knees and prayed all night long, and the attack never happened, and they left. It wasn't until several years later when John Paton led that chief to the Lord that he asked him about that night. Why didn't they attack? And the man's response was, well, who were all those people with you? The ones with the swords. He said, we were alone, just me and my wife. No, there were hundreds of men with swords surrounding the camp. You are not alone. Or you can think of Steve Saint. This is really interesting. You probably have seen the movie End of the Spear, and you probably watched the scene where the Nate Saint and Jim Elliott and all those were killed by the tribe in Ecuador. You probably remember the scene and how they looked around and they were listening to singing. That story didn't come out until years later. It wasn't until years later when Steve Saint, Nate Saint's son, is with the tribe, and Jim Elliott's wife is with the tribe, and they're looking at the place where their husbands were and fathers were all massacred. And this woman says, and that is where we saw the choir. And she describes this group, quote, I want to get her right, hundreds, no, that's the other one, men dressed in cloth, standing above the trees and singing. 4 different people involved in the murder of Jim Elliott and Nate Saint said that there were people standing in the air singing over the death of the people they just killed. They were not alone. They were not alone. The angel of the Lord encamps around all those who fear him, and he delivers them. Do not fear. Those who are with us, as Elisha said, are more than those who are with them. Do not fear. Then Jacob sent messengers before him to Esau. So he's seen the angels. He's camped. He knows angels are camped around him. Okay, so what am I going to do? I'm going to try and make this transition back to Esau as easy as possible. I'm going to make a contact. There's a Proverbs in Proverbs chapter 15, verse 1. We should all learn this one. A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh answer stirs up anger. When you smart off in response in an argument, I can tell you the conclusion. It's never good. Why do we do it? So he's going to send a soft answer. When he left, he had stolen his blessing. He'd stolen his birthright. He was the Lord of all Isaac's stuff. And when he left, he was going to be killed by Esau. When he comes back, he humbles himself. Jacob sent messengers before him to Esau, his brother, in the land of Seir, in the country of Edom. And he commanded them, saying, speak thus to my lord Esau, humble. Thus your servant Jacob, humble, says, I have dwelt with Laban and stayed there until now. I have oxen, donkeys, flocks, and male and female servants, and I have sent to tell my Lord that I may find favor in your sight. He's saying this, you are great, Esau, and I don't need anything. I have not come to take anything from you. Soft answer. So he sends the messengers out. He's camped. He's at least 40, 50 miles from Esau, from the way he ends up at the river Jabbok. And so he's at least 40 or 50 miles from Esau. Then the messengers return to Jacob. They go out. He stays in his camp with the angels. It's a great time, the double camp. The messengers come back. I cannot wait for the news, saying, we came to your brother Esau. Fantastic. They found him. They told him that your servant doesn't need anything. You're the Lord Esau. And he also is coming to meet you. Oh, it's so great. He's coming to meet you with 400 men. That's bad. So I just want to say this much. No matter what happens in Genesis 33, because we see everything turns out okay. I cannot even grasp in my mind that when Esau took off with his 400 men, he was thinking everything is okay. Why would you go visit your brother who's hanging out with his wives and children and donkeys with 400 men? He didn't bring his family. He didn't bring gifts for a feast. He brought 400 men. He's not coming as a friend. So how are you going to respond? So Jacob, I said, no problem. So Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed. I would think so. And he divided the people that were with him and the flocks and herds and camels into two companies. Now, we read this and it's like a history book, but let's get into the reality of it. We're going to die. Okay, so here's what we got to do. We need to split our camp so that while he kills half of us, the other half can run for their lives. Can you imagine your dad saying that to you? Now look, kids, half of you go over here, half of you go over here. Take some men and servants with you. Somebody's going to die. The other people, when you see your family being slaughtered, run for your lives. Imagine that. Pretty serious situation. And he said, if Esau comes to the one company and attacks it, then the other company which is left will escape. He's planning, how do I defend myself? I don't think this is sin. I've read a lot of commentaries that say this guy's in sin. In fact, if he is in sin, then you are all in sin. Because I think every one of us would try and figure out a way, just in case there is an attack. What am I going to do? I'm not just going to stand around. I know a lot of people have been thinking about that since the UCC shooting. What are you going to do if someone walks in here? You just going to say, I trust the Lord, and stand there? Don't answer out loud. But each one of us is struggling with that in our own heart. What are we going to do? Would I be willing to defend myself if such a thing occurred? Or would I be willing to defend others? Or he's struggling with this. What am I going to do? Does he know the angels are there? Yes. Do you know the angels are there? Yes. And you're still struggling with that question. Then Jacob said, now by the way, this is the first prayer that we have recorded of Jacob since this ridiculously self-centered, arrogant prayer of Genesis 28. Let me read his original prayer, and you can hear the difference. His original prayer goes like this. If God will be with me and keep me in this way that I'm going and give me bread to eat and clothing to put on so that I come back to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. Remember we talked about, that's such a new believer prayer. When you get saved, it's really hard to get your eyes off of yourself. And then for the rest of your life, you try and learn how to get your eyes off of yourself. That's discipleship. Less of me, more of you. And it's hard because the flesh dies hard. 20 years earlier, he prayed that self-centered, arrogant, then if all this is true, then you're good enough to be my God. Right? His focus is upon himself. But this prayer starts different. In fact, this prayer I found really reflects what Jesus taught us to pray. Jesus taught us to pray focused on God. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Right? First, the glory of God. Listen to what it says. O God of my father Abraham, and God of my father Isaac, the Lord who said to me, return to your country and to your family, and I will deal well with you. I am not worthy of the least of all the mercies and of all the truth which you have shown your servant. For I crossed over this Jordan with my staff, and now I have become two companies. So he starts out with, you are so great, God, so much greater than me. And then he focuses, like Jesus said, forgive us our trespasses, lead us not into temptation. Forgive us our trespasses. He talks about, Lord, I am sinful. You are great. When you're praying, start out your prayers by honoring God. Now, that doesn't mean when you're falling off a cliff, you have to go, Our Father, who art in heaven, right? You don't have to do that. You could say, help, and God gets it. But when you have quiet time before the Lord and you're seeking God, feel compelled to first glorify Him. And then to realize that whatever He does for you is always going to be mercy. It's always going to be mercy. What does God owe us? Nothing. He is always the source, and we are always the sink, as we would say in biology. We're where it goes, and He's where it comes from. Forgive us our trespasses. I am unworthy. And then, at the end of the prayer, it says, deliver us from evil, right? Lead us not into temptation, deliver us from evil. Look at what he says. Deliver me, I pray, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him. Be honest in your prayers to God. What a silly thing to pretend like you're not afraid before God, who actually knows everything. In 1 Samuel 2, as Jared was reading today, the Lord is the God of all knowledge, and by Him actions are weighed. In other words, He knows what's behind it. So when you're like, I'm not afraid, but inside you're terrified, God says, why are you lying to me? Feel free to say, I am scared to death, God. That's what He's saying. We're going to die. And He even goes into how, lest He come and attack me and the mother with the children. He's going to kill all of us, even the kids and the wives. And then He holds on to God's promise. And I'll tell you what, there's no greater prayer, I believe, than when you can pray a promise that God has written down, because His word will not change. But God, you have said, God knows that, but it helps me, it encourages me. For you said, I will surely treat you well and make your descendants as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. He prays, he asks for deliverance, but he wasn't ready for the answer. You know what the answer is? Okay, I'm going to cripple you. That's the answer. My ways are not your ways, nor are your thoughts my thoughts. As far as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my thoughts above your thoughts, and my ways than your ways. Who could ever think that the way of God's grace was going to be through the cross? The cross. His very own disciples, Jesus, for 3 years tried to pound it into him. Do you not understand? I'm going to be killed. And they couldn't get it even till the very last day when Peter pulls out a sword to keep him from being killed. For God's ways are different than our ways. Jacob, I'll answer your prayer. I'm going to cripple you. Now Esau is running on his camel or horse or donkey or whatever he was on to meet them. Deliver us, O Lord. And the Lord answers his prayer. Now, George Mueller, you guys know who George Mueller is? Great man of faith. He's the guy that prayed and food would show up for his orphans, and he never asked for money, and at the end he was supporting tons of missionaries and lots of orphans, all by faith. He just pray. Great man of God. Well, if you had an opportunity to ask George Mueller a question, what would you ask him? If you got a chance to ask Mueller a question, what would you ask him? Go ahead and respond. What would you ask him? How do you pray? What do you pray for? How long do you wait? These are all great prayers. How do I build up my faith? Somebody asked him once, this is written down, what is the most important part of prayer? Isn't that a good question? God is so hearing your prayers. What is the most important part of prayer? Does anyone know what Mueller answered? You'll be blown away. The 15 minutes after I say amen. Because my actions will prove whether or not I trust God. He said the most important part of prayer is the 15 minutes after I say amen. What an amazing statement. And how poignant. Do I pray and then fear? Do I pray and then connive? Do I pray and then manipulate? This is what Jacob's about to do. He prays, asks for deliverance. He's surrounded by angels. But you know what? I'm going to make a plan. And so he just sort of reverts back. How would I win my brother? I'll tell you what. I'm going to send him 500 animals with servants to go with them, and I'm going to divide them up into groups. They're not all going to go at once. They're going to go in groups, so first one gift, and then another gift, and then another gift. So he's going to have to make it through 5 gifts of hundreds of animals before he ever reaches my kids. See, he's thinking, I got a plan, I got to prepare. So he lodged there that same night and took what came to his hand as a present for Esau's brother, 200 female goats and 20 male goats, 200 ewes and 20 rams, 30 milk camels. A milk camel, what does that look like? But anyways, with their colts, 40 cows. I would never want to milk a camel. I couldn't get past that. First of all, these little tiny udders. Second of all, they're filthy beasts, and they spit and they kick and they bite. Terrible. Sorry, I don't like camels. 40 cows and 10 bulls, 20 female donkeys and 10 foals. Now, I got to stop right there and just note, he's got a lot of animals. This is sort of his gift. He got all these animals in how many years? The first 14, he didn't make a dime with Laban. So when it says in Genesis chapter 30, verse 43, it says, the man became exceedingly prosperous and had large flocks, female and male servants, and camels and donkeys, and the word there for exceedingly largest is he burst out. God really blessed this guy. He knows how God can bless. So he's like, I'm going to give away 500 of my animals. Then he delivered them to the hand of his servants, every drove by itself, and said to his servants, pass over before me, go over the river Jordan, and put some distance between successive droves. So in other words, don't run together. Make it so he has to run into multiple people. And he commanded the first one, saying, when Esau my brother meets you and asks you, saying, to whom do you belong and where are you going? Who are these in front of you? Then you shall say, they are your servant Jacob's. It is a present sent to my lord Esau, and behold, he also is behind us. Now there is a proverb that says this, and it's a true proverb. A gift in secret will pacify anger. Just remember that. Sometimes giving takes away anger. So he commanded the second and the third and all who followed the drove, saying in this manner, you shall speak to Esau when you find him. So there's at least 3 different groups. And also say, when you get done giving him the hundreds of animals and all the servants who are with him, behold, your servant Jacob is behind us. For he said, I will appease him with the present that goes before me, and afterward I will see his face. Perhaps he will accept me. What's the other option? He'll kill me. This is a tough moment. You ever had any tough moments in your life? Life is just not cheesecake, is it? Sometimes it's rough. And the patriarchs went through rough times. How did God handle this? So the present went on over before him, but he himself lodged that night in the camp. And he arose that night, so he gets up in the dark. He gets up in the dark, or at least in the evening, and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants. He had 4 wives. We're not going down that road. And his 11 sons, and he crossed over the ford of Jabbok. Now, Jabbok is about 25 miles north of the Dead Sea, and it flows from the east out of the desert into the Jordan River. So Jacob has been traveling from Syria. He's been coming down south. He has not crossed over the Jordan River. He's on the east side where it's dry, and he's coming down, skirting the Jordan River, and he's about to make his entry into the promised land. So he sends his family over, and they crossed over the ford of Jabbok. He took them and sent them over the brook and sent over what he had. Okay? He's moving in. Then Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. Why was he alone? Nobody can answer that. So whatever you come up with, nobody knows the answer. I don't think he was sacrificing his family and hiding on the other side of the river. Maybe he was. If he was, he has really gone down in my esteem. I think he was seeking God. Why would you send everybody over? I mean, Esau's not going to attack at night. I mean, for goodness sakes, they don't have spotlights. And so the attack's going to be in the morning. He puts everybody over there in 2 droves, 2 groups, 2 camps, splits them up, and he comes back over, gets everybody over in the promised land. He comes back over, and he spends the night alone. Have you ever just wanted to be alone in a crisis? You ever just get sick of everybody? You need to be alone. You need to be quiet. You need to know God's will. You need assurance. Maybe he wanted to cry. Maybe he wanted to yell. This time alone with God changes his life forever. Changes his life forever. It is the last night he'll have before he meets his archenemy and brother Esau. And it's the most important time of his whole life. And I began thinking about how important it is to be alone. I love corporate prayer, but Jesus himself told us, go pray in a closet, and your Father who sees in secret shall reward you openly. Some people have no private life with Christ. They only have a public life. And they love God, but they have no private life. Those people are weak in the faith. Because their faith isn't about them and God. Their faith is about them and their friends and God. They find they cannot pray unless there's another person present. If that's you, I want to encourage you to learn to be alone with God. Moses was alone with God at the burning bush. Moses was alone with God on the top of Mount Sinai. David was alone with God when he was fleeing from Saul because he was going to be killed. And he wrote psalm after psalm after psalm. Saul of Tarsus, who became Paul, was alone with God outside of Damascus in Arabia for 3 years. The greatest changes in your life are not going to occur in a public event. They will occur when it's just you and God. When the conversation is between you and God. Not you and your brother, not you and your uncle, not you and your husband, not you and your wife, not you and your parents, you and God. And when you hear from God, Terry told me this at one point when he was discipling me. When you hear from God, and it's not from a man, your life changes. But if I tell you, even if I'm right, what God says and what God thinks, it has less power. The greatest way to have a changed life is to hear God speak to you, not through another, because then it's yours. And so Jacob is alone with God. And it's interesting, a wrestling match begins. You ever been there? You ever been in that wrestling match? Now, here's the weird thing about this. It's a weird verse. There's a lot of weird verses in the Bible, but they're true. God, we're told, because later on he tells us it's God, comes in the presence of a man. Jacob does not initiate the wrestling. Jacob is over on the other side of the river, and he's just sitting there in his loneliness. And God, in human flesh, how much does God love us? God in human flesh is going to interact with him. Now we know in John 1:18, you should write that down, that this is Jesus Christ. Only he's not named Jesus Christ because he's not born of Mary. He's just God in the flesh. And God in the flesh is Jesus, or we'll just call him the Son. We know that Abraham ate with God, it says in Genesis. But we also know John says you can't see God. He's a spirit. He tells Moses, you'll die if you see God. Yet Abraham ate with them. And so we find out the only way you'll ever on earth be able to see God is to be able to see God in, we call it incarnate, which means in flesh. God in flesh is the only protection you have from the glory of God. And God in flesh is the Son. And the Son comes and wrestles with Jacob. This is the Son of God, whom we later call Jesus. Think about how crazy that is. Can you think about that, brother? Think about it. There you are, you're alone. You're struggling with the troubles in your life. You've made these decisions or whatever, and you're alone. And Jesus Christ walks up, grabs the back of your neck, puts you in a half Nelson, and pins you to the ground. And you're thinking, this is not the God that I was thinking about. I asked for deliverance, right? What is God doing? God cannot deliver you unless he conquers you. God cannot deliver you unless he conquers you. And the flesh dies hard. And we all say this. How many have not prayed, God, whatever it takes, have your way in me. Whatever it takes, have your way in me. And suddenly, terrible crises happen and we blame the devil. And yet God is answering. You don't understand, Travis. I think at the moment of my life, and you've heard it many times, I'm sorry, but it's my testimony, so it's close to me, when God told me to quit my career, give up all my wealth, move away from my dream, and become a pastor. Which in my esteem, in my thoughts, was the lowest of the low. Worse yet, he says, go to Camas Valley. Now I get to be the lowest of the low in the lowest of the low places. And all, it wasn't about the spiritual nature of it. Literally, my battle was, what am I going to do? Pump gas for a living? That was my battle with God. I am making a lot of money. I'm powerful. I'm important. I have staff. I set my own hours. This whole me. And God says, now go give it all up and live on nothing and beg for money and pump gas. And until he broke me, he could not bless me. And I tell you, I thank the Lord Jesus Christ that for 6 months he had me in a half Nelson and pounded my head into the ground and waited and waited and waited until I gave up. That's what he's going to do to Jacob. He shows up, grapples with Jacob, wrestles with him, sort of has a Romans 7 moment. Listen to this. The good that I will to do, I do not do, but the evil I will not to do, that I practice. Now, if I do what I will not to do, it's no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. I find then a law that evil is inside of me. There's still evil in us. This is Paul the Apostle. I still have evil inside of me, but I want to do good. For I delight in the law of God. I love the Bible according to the inward man, but I see another war, a law in my members warring against the law of my mind and bringing me into captivity. You could put down full Nelson. To the law of sin which is in my members. O wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? I thank God through Jesus Christ. Jacob could say those exact words. I thank God that Jesus Christ broke my leg. Terry's example last week was amazing. It was perfect about the man whose son, 7 years old, died in a horrendous accident and sent him spiraling down into drugs and alcohol and lost his marriage and just about lost his life, tried to kill himself. And then he got saved. God broke him. And he was able to say, after all those tragedies, he would not change a thing. Why? Because God conquered him. God conquered him. God wants to conquer you. He wants to rule you. All of you. And if you'll let him, he'll wrestle with you. He'll wrestle. Now, this is definitely spiritual and physical because I don't know how anybody wrestles all night long. And I mean, you can't say it's just spiritual either because he pops his hip out of socket. Now, that's a tough dream. So there's a little of a mix. It's kind of like when Jesus was in the wilderness and he was being tempted by the devil and he ends up on the pinnacle of the temple. Nobody really gets that, except it happened in the Spirit somehow. And he's also on a high mountain and sees all the nations of the earth. How does that happen in the wilderness? Well, it's a mix of physical and spiritual going on, and I don't really even know if Jacob understands it, but there's this wrestling match, and he wrestles all night long. You know, all Jacob had to do was quit, give up. But the flesh dies hard, doesn't it? The flesh dies hard. So God's going to break his hip. And it'll be the best thing that ever happened to Jacob in all of his life. In fact, his whole nature will change. He'll no longer be strong. My grace is sufficient for you. My strength is made perfect in weakness. It's that discipleship lesson that none of us want to learn, but we all have to. We can't rule God. Now, when he saw that he did not prevail against him, so the Son of God saw that Jacob's not giving up. He touched the socket of his hip. He went, "Eek." And the socket of his hip and the socket of Jacob's hip was out of joint as he wrestled with him. He still was wrestling. Now he's flopping. You ever see that Joe Theismann? Remember that? That was the most horrendous break I ever saw in my life, and they replayed it again and again and again with the Washington Redskins. It was, obviously, it's still in my mind. It was something. Well, that's what his leg's doing. He's fighting with the Son of God. Is he going to win? No. Why didn't he break his hip earlier? I mean, he's like, I'll just poop, and blows his hip out. Why didn't he do it like 6 hours ago? Why doesn't God just break you and make you submit? Because that's not the best way. Jesus has shown us the best way, who was able to say, I only do what I see my Father in heaven do. The Son of Man, he says, most assuredly, the Son of Man can do nothing of himself. But we still think we can do something of ourselves. I mean, I could tell you a story. I mean, for those of you who don't like stories about killing little Bambis, we wiped one out. And it was a miracle story. It was a miracle story. God told me this deer, I know I'm going to give you a story, and if you don't like killing, plug your ears. This deer was 350 yards away. Jared has never shot a deer in his life. He's 13. 350 yards away. He's got ballistics that Doug put out for this gun that's not even his gun. He's got to shoot at least 10 inches above the deer to hit the deer. It's at such a great distance. He shoots, clean misses, hits the rocks down below. I mean, it dropped way more than he was ready for. And God tells me that deer is dead. And yet I watched the deer jump up and run away. And God tells me, that deer is dead. I gave that deer to your son. This is just a story, but this is how God is in all things. So what are you going to do? It was a clean miss. So we walk towards where it was bedded down, 350 yards away. We go up and down and up and down and up and down. And we get over there, and I look to Jared and I say, did God give you that deer, Jared? He goes, I don't know, Dad. I don't know. I said, God gave you that deer, Jared. Yeah, he's testing my faith, Dad. He's testing my faith. We can do nothing of ourselves. Nothing. So we get over there, and you know what that deer did? It ran, how far down to the bottom of the draw do you think that is, Jack? How far? Down to the draw, the bottom. He went way out of sight into the trees down there. He ran away downhill, a long ways away from us. Right after Jared says, I guess God is just testing my faith, and I say, God gave you that deer. I expect it had died, like it had choked on a rock or something. I really did. You're laughing, but I was sure God, it must have died. It's part of that rock shot up and stuck in its nostril, and it's slowly bleeding to death somehow. No. He sent that deer right back to us. We're standing there where it was shot at. It runs right back up the hill to us and jumps on a bullet. We can do nothing through Christ, without Christ. We can do nothing. We can't even hunt deer. We can't walk down a hill. We can't brush our teeth. We can do nothing through Christ. And until we learn that, we'll never be great in the kingdom of heaven. Until you realize you can do nothing except through Christ. Jacob's going to learn this. Suffering is often the way God will conquer a person so he can actually bless us. This is really interesting. He wrestled all night. Why didn't he blow his hip out? Because he wanted him to give up himself. It's always easier, isn't it, brother? It's always easier to just give up yourself rather than wait for that consequence that breaks you. But for most of us, it takes a breaking. Did for Jacob. There's this guy, he was a Scottish preacher in the 1800s too. His name was Andrew Bonar. He has a really interesting story. He says in the highlands of Scotland that sheep will sometimes look down 10, 12 feet and see some grass on a cliff, and they'll make their way down to this precarious ledge, and they'll be stuck on that cliff because they can't get back up, and they were down there eating grass. He said, do you know what the shepherd does? Nothing. He leaves them there until that sheep becomes so weak it's near death. And then he crawls down and grabs that sheep and pulls it up. And when you ask the shepherd why he does that, because the shepherd will say, because if I went down when they were healthy, they would jump off the cliff. They'd run from me. And so I have to wait until they're completely destitute, because then they'll just lay there and you can crawl down to them, you can pick them up, and you can save their life. That is the testimony of Jesus Christ in my life and probably in your life as well. Verse 26, and he said, let me go, for the day breaks. This is God speaking. Let me go. So at this point, he's clinging to him. But he said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. Now, I don't want you to get the wrong idea. You've got to write Hosea 12, 3-6 next to this verse, because this almost sounds like Jacob's like, you're going to give me a blessing because I'm a son of God and I'm in the kingdom and I have the kingdom keys. And I'm sorry, that's what they're preaching nowadays all over the TV. He's not doing that. Hosea 12, verse 3 says, in strength, Jacob struggled with God. Yes, he struggled with an angel and prevailed, the angel. How did he prevail? Here it is. You ready? At this point in time, when did he get the blessing? Hosea tells us he wept and sought favor from him. It wasn't until Jacob was hip is blown out, he went from wrestling Jacob to clinging Jacob, hanging onto his leg, crying, please, please bless me. And when he did that, when he was broken and he was needy and he could do nothing by himself, God looks down and says, I will. It's all I've been waiting for. It's all I've been waiting for. I will bless you. And he said, let me go. And he said, not unless you bless me. So he said to him, okay, here's your blessing. What is your name? He said, Jacob. Now you got to remember, Jacob means supplanter or heel grabber, someone who's taking from someone else, removing their position. And that's what he did to Esau. What's your name? Jacob, supplanter, heel grabber. And God says to him, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. For you have struggled with God and with men and have prevailed. Wait a second, how did he prevail? He got broken and needy and cried out in prayer, help me. When do you prevail? It reminds me of Revelation 3:12 that says, he who overcomes, I will write on him the name of my God. I will write on him my new name. You know how you're going to overcome? By being broken. That's how you're going to overcome. Now, it's interesting. The change of a name, that's his blessing. Your blessing is, I'm changing your name. The change of a name marks that in God's eyes, this man is no longer Simon, but Peter, rock. Peter wasn't a rock yet, but in Jesus' eyes, you're the rock. He was proclaiming a change in the way God viewed him. Abram, exalted father, became Abraham, father of a multitude, because in God's eyes, he is now the father of a multitude. The change of name went from heel grabber or supplanter to Israel. Now, what does Israel mean? It means one of two things. It has two parts to it. It means ruling and God, and they're put together. And some people say it's prince with God. But you know what Daniel means? Do you know back there, Daniel, what Daniel means? What's it mean? What was that? God is judge. The L is at the end, but it's not the object, it's the subject. Daniel. God is judge. Israel means God rules. Jacob now can't run. His plan of escape no longer works. He can't run. Esau, his enemy, will come right up to him, and except for God's grace, he's dead. He finally is ruled by God, totally trusting in God. His name is changed. He couldn't be delivered from his enemy until God delivered from him his own self. I'm going to ask you, how dependent are you on God? Really? How dependent are you on God? When Paul says pray about all things, do we really? Or do we have some of those things on our own? I could do it. I've done this before. Keep going. Then Jacob asked, saying, tell me your name, I pray. Well, at this point, we know his name, but he won't be named for about 1,000 more years. And he said, why is it that you ask about my name? And he blessed him there. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. Just as he crossed over Penuel, which is also the same thing as Peniel, or face of God, that's what it means. The sun rose on him, and he limped on his hip. Did you pick that up? The sun rose on him. When did the sun go down? Genesis 28, when he left, ran from Esau. And then after he's finally broken, and he's no longer Jacob, he's now Israel, the sun rises on him. All things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose. All things, even the tragedies, even the crippling breaking. God is in it. He is in it for you, to bless you. His purpose is to bless me. This name Israel will last now for thousands of years beyond Jacob. It is currently on a map of the world. The name on the map of the world, Israel. God rules. At the end, all nations shall come against Israel. And Israel shall have victory over all nations because God rules. If you're Pharaoh and God says, let my people go, he is saying, Israel, God rules, Pharaoh, I'll destroy you. When he says, your name is Israel, he's saying, I promise I will never forsake you. In Romans chapter 11, Israel shall be saved. The people of God shall be saved. You are saved according to Romans 11 because God has made you, you know what he says? Israel. You are grafted into Israel. The people of God are all Israel because God rules. It's an amazing thing that happens here because God breaks one man and makes him dependent upon him. "20 years earlier, the sun set on self-centered Jacob. 20 years later, the sun rises on limping, broken, submissive, God-centered, blessed for all eternity, Israel. Therefore, to this day, the children of Israel do not eat the muscle that shrank, which is on the hip socket, right here, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip and the muscle that shrank." That's really interesting. Not only does he limp back to camp across the river by himself with a stick, he tells everybody what happened. That is hard. When God breaks you, it is so hard to share that, isn't it? But he did. His lesson became a permanent remembrance for the nation, all the way until Moses wrote Genesis. You know what? We today don't even eat that muscle because God made a point that is the crippled man that God can help. It's the broken man that God can bless. 2 lessons to end with. One is that pass on what you've learned from the Lord, even though it's embarrassing to you. Secondly, take time to be alone with God. To be alone and to have him tell you, not someone else. what's going on. The third thing is not really an application, and it's what I'll end with, is it really interests me. He says, God, when I first left Esau, I came out with a staff. A staff. This was my protection, God. It was my occupation. It was my sole possession. It was my everything. The staff. And now 20 years later, I can't even walk without a staff. This was a symbol of my authority, my ranking, my power. You know, when Judah's staff is taken by Tamar, remember that? It proved, it had its insignia on it, it said, I am the man who owns this staff. It was an authority. Moses throws the rod or the staff down, and it eats Pharaoh's snakes, remember? And the whole story? It's a symbol of authority. I came with just the authority of my staff, and at the very end, it's very interesting, he can't even walk without it. It becomes something that God gives him to help him along in life. But this is the part that really blessed me, and it's maybe a little spiritual, but it really blesses me. In Genesis, right before Jacob dies, Israel dies, you know what it says? By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshipped, leaning on the top of his staff. It was his mark for the rest of his life that God broke me. And I think about the things in my life that are permanently wrong with me. As an example, just the sufferings of my son marked me, and they're good. Theron has permanent back damage, that if a doctor would have found it, he could have been put in a back brace, and he wouldn't be in pain every day, all day long. But he is. But if you ask him about the scar on his face, about the fact that his back hurts all the time, it's God's mark. It's God's mark. Right? Probably you have a God's mark. I do. In my life, I have God's mark. Some of them are emotional, some of them are physical. Right, Jacob? Who gets flipped off a bronc and drug around and kicked in the head, and his leg goes 50 different directions, and he's crippled up until God can finally. Interesting, it just struck me, your name's Jacob. He blew your hip out. That's something. Yours is pretty cool. But you have one too. Learn from it. Grow with it. Share it. Be broken so God can bless you. Let's pray. Father, thank you for this word. Please apply it to our lives. It's a good word, Lord. Really hard. God, I don't know exactly, well, Lord, I do. It's always pride. Why we don't just submit, why we wrestle with you all night long, and we don't just simply submit. And you have to break something for us to do that. I want to thank you that you did that in each of our lives. You broke me in my greed, Lord, and I'm just thinking of Jacob, Mitzkis, Lord, you broke his leg and took away his strength and ability to work so you could bless him. Lord, but I know that story is not just about me or him or Theron. That story is about us, every one of us. And God, right now, I guarantee, I know by the Spirit of the Lord, it's pretty clear, God, that there are people in our congregation right now listening to this who are in the wrestling match. And that you have given them a warning that if they wrestle without giving up, they will soon be broken. Lord, please let them learn this lesson from Jacob before they have to be broken. But if not, God, don't give up until they're broken. Because God, Jacob and I, Lord, testify that it is good when the Lord disciplines us. It is good. For those whom the Lord loves, he chastens and he scourges every son. Lord, it's true. And God, I want to pray this hard prayer for all those who are suffering from UCC. God, use it to cause them to lean on this tragedy and worship God like Jacob did with his staff. We love you, Lord. We bless your name. In Jesus' name, amen.